Here is a fact that should not be true. A woman living in ancient Egypt, 3,500 years ago, could own her own property. She could run her own business. She could sign her own legal contracts. She could take a man to court. And if she wanted out of her marriage, she could file for divorce, walk away, and keep her share of everything they'd built together. Now here's the part that makes it almost unbelievable. More than 1,000 years after Egypt was doing all of this, the women of ancient Greece, the so-called birthplace of democracy and Western civilization, had almost none of those rights. A Greek woman was essentially the property of her father, then her husband. An Egyptian woman, 1,000 years earlier, could divorce hers and keep the house. So how did love and marriage actually work in a civilization that, in some ways, was more advanced about relationships than the world would be for the next 3,000 years? How did Egyptians fall in love? How did they date? What did a wedding look like? And was there even a wedding at all? The answers are full of surprises. Love poems that could have been written yesterday, a marriage system with no ceremony and no gods involved, contracts that protected women better than some modern ones, and a few customs at the very top of society that are genuinely disturbing. Let's start with the thing every human being recognizes: falling in love. Because the Egyptians, it turns out, were hopeless romantics. We know this because they wrote it down, and some of their love poetry survives, scratched onto papyrus and pottery over 3,000 years ago. And reading it is uncanny, because the feelings are precisely the same as yours. In these poems, young lovers call each other brother and sister, not because they were related, but as terms of affection, the way we might say baby or my love. And they ache. One speaks of their heart pounding when they catch sight of their beloved. One describes being so lovesick they've taken to their bed, and declares that the best doctor in the world is useless to them. Only the sight of their love can cure them. One young man stands at the door, hoping the girl's mother won't notice him lingering. One compares the beloved's body to the sweetest things they know. 3,000 years ago, a teenager lay awake at night, sick with longing over someone who might not even know they existed, and wrote a poem about it. Nothing about being human has changed. The technology changed, the heart didn't. So young Egyptians felt all of it: the crushes, the longing, the obsession. But how did they actually get together? How did you go from a love poem to a household? And here's the first big surprise. For ordinary Egyptians, there was probably no real dating the way we'd think of it. But there was also far less of the rigid, locked-down courtship you might expect from the ancient world. Egypt was relatively relaxed. Young men and women worked near each other, met at festivals, celebrations, and religious holidays. Those big, noisy, beer-soaked feasts where people danced and mingled late into the night. Attraction was real, and people clearly acted on it. Families were involved, of course. A mother might help arrange a good match. Fathers negotiated the terms. But this was not purely a cold transaction. The love poems make it clear that young people had their own desires and pursued them. The ideal age for a girl to marry was probably in her early to mid-teens, with the young man a bit older, often once he could support a household. Marriages often happened within the same town, the same trade, the same social class. The boy next door, quite literally, was who you ended up with. But now we reach the single strangest, most fascinating fact about Egyptian marriage. And it's something they did not have. There was no wedding ceremony. Stop and think about how strange that is. This is the civilization that turned everything into ritual. They had elaborate ceremonies for death, for the gods, for the crowning of kings, for the flooding of a river. They mummified cats. And yet, as far as we can tell, marriage, the joining of two lives, had no religious ceremony, no temple service, no priest, no exchange of vows before a god. The gods were simply not invited. So how did you actually get married? You moved in together. That was basically it. Marriage in ancient Egypt was when a man and a woman decided to start a household and live together. The phrase they used for taking a wife translated to something like, to establish a household. She gathered her belongings, walked from her father's house to his, and they were, from that moment, married. There may have been a feast, a celebration with family and food and far too much beer, the way we'd throw a party. But the marriage itself wasn't a ceremony. It was a decision, made real by simply starting a life together. In other words, the ancient Egyptians were essentially doing what we now call moving in together, and they treated it as the actual marriage, with no paperwork required to make it real. Love and cohabitation made the marriage, not a god, not a state, not a signature. But, and this is where the Egyptians reveal how clever they really were, while marriage didn't need a contract, they absolutely used them. And those contracts are extraordinary. These were essentially marriage settlements, or prenuptial agreements, and they appear more and more over Egyptian history. They didn't create the marriage. They protected the people in it, especially the woman. A typical contract laid out what the wife brought into the marriage, what the husband was obligated to provide for her support: food, clothing, oil, a set amount of grain every year, and, crucially, what she was entitled to if the marriage ended. Read that again. 3,000 years ago, they were writing agreements that guaranteed a wife's financial security and spelled out her settlement in case of divorce. Some contracts specified that the wife would receive a large payment if the husband left her, or that the property would be divided, or that her dowry would be returned in full. Some even stated that the children would inherit the family property, protecting the wife's bloodline. There are contracts where a husband essentially promises a penalty payment if he takes a second wife or leaves. The agreements treated the woman as a legal and economic person, with assets, rights, and recourse. This is why an Egyptian woman had power that would vanish from much of the world for millennia. She owned property in her own name and kept it through marriage. She could buy, sell, lend, and inherit. She could run a business and keep her profits. She could go to court without a male guardian speaking for her. She could make her own will and leave her property to whomever she chose. Marriage didn't dissolve her into her husband. She remained herself, legally and financially intact. Which makes divorce the next surprise. Because in Egypt, divorce was real, it was allowed, and either spouse could initiate it. There was no court needed to grant it, no god to disapprove. If a marriage wasn't working, one partner could simply declare it over, and the household would dissolve, much as it had formed. And then the contract did its job. The property was divided. The wife took what was owed to her under the agreement, and both were free to marry again. A divorced woman wasn't necessarily ruined or disgraced. She could return to her family, keep her property, and remarry. Reasons for divorce ranged from the serious to the simple: inability to have children, adultery, or just the plain fact that two people no longer wanted to be together. Now, let's be honest and not over-romanticize it. This was still an ancient patriarchy. Men generally held more power, ran the government, and a wealthy man could take more than one wife or keep concubines, while the same freedom was not extended to women. Adultery by a wife was judged far more harshly than by a husband. Most women's lives revolved around the home and children. Egypt was not a feminist paradise. But measured against the ancient world around it, and against much of the world that came after, Egyptian women had a legal and economic standing that is genuinely astonishing. Their marriages were, by the standards of history, remarkably equal partnerships. And the goal of all of it, the love poems, the household, the contracts, was the same thing nearly everyone wanted: a family. Children were treasured in Egypt, seen as a blessing and a kind of immortality. They wanted a partner to build a life with, raise children with, grow old beside, and, in their deepest belief, be reunited with in the afterlife. Tomb paintings show husbands and wives sitting together, embracing, holding hands, equal in size and affection, expecting to spend eternity side by side. They carved their love into stone, meant to last forever. But there's one corner of Egyptian marriage we can't skip, because it's the part everyone eventually asks about: the royal family. Because at the very top, among the pharaohs, there was a custom that breaks every rule we just described. Egyptian royalty practiced incest. Pharaohs married their own sisters, half-sisters, sometimes their daughters. This wasn't done by ordinary Egyptians. For everyday people, it was not the norm. But for the royal line, it was deliberate. The reasoning was partly religious. The gods themselves married their siblings. Osiris married his sister Isis, so the divine royal family mirrored the gods. And it was partly political, keeping the bloodline pure and the power concentrated within the family, with no outsiders marrying in. And it came at a terrible cost. The most famous pharaoh of all, Tutankhamun, was very likely the product of a brother and sister. Modern DNA analysis of the royal mummies suggests his parents were siblings, and Tutankhamun's own body shows the price: a clubbed foot, bone disorders, and frailty that left him walking with a cane. The divine blood the pharaohs were so desperate to keep pure was, generation after generation, quietly poisoning them. They married their sisters to stay like gods, and it made them sicker than their own peasants. So pull it all together and look at what the ancient Egyptians actually understood about love. They knew the ache of a crush and wrote poetry about it that still sounds like us. They let people meet, mingle, and choose. They decided that marriage wasn't a ceremony you performed, but a life you started together. They protected the vulnerable partner with contracts centuries ahead of their time. They gave women the right to own, to earn, to leave. And they imagined love as something that didn't even end at death, a partnership meant to continue, hand in hand, forever. Strip away the sand and the hieroglyphs, and an Egyptian marriage looks startlingly familiar. Two young people meet at a party. They fall for each other. They move in together and call it a life. They sign an agreement to protect what's theirs. Sometimes it lasts forever. Sometimes it ends and they move on. And through all of it, they just want what most of us want: someone to come home to. We like to think we invented the modern relationship: the love match, the equal partnership, the prenup, the right to walk away. We didn't. A couple by the Nile, 3,000 years ago, holding hands in a painting meant to last for eternity, got there long before us. They didn't need a ceremony to know they were in love. They just started a life, exactly like you might.